On this special edition of Independent Sources, the police and the policed. Can police departments with a history of aggressive tactics truly be reformed? And what would it take to do so?
Rather than focusing so much on training and trying to turn police into officer-friendly, what we need to do is to find real alternatives to relying on the police.
That discussion and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. Tension between the police and those they police in New York City is reaching a breaking point. Just this past weekend, some protesters attacked two NYPD lieutenants on the Brooklyn Bridge as hundreds of thousands demonstrated against a grand jury's failure to indict the officer who placed Eric Garner in an alleged chokehold. That case, along with a similar outcome in the case of Michael Brown, has put police departments around the country under increased scrutiny and pressure to reform their tactics. Joining me in studio to discuss this issue of ending the warrior cop mentality are Brooklyn College sociology professors Drs. Lawrence Johnson and Alex Vitale. Dr. Johnson, we've seen a lot of protests since the Michael Brown and the Eric Garner incidents. Do you think these protests would lead to some kind of meaningful changes within NYPD and other police departments across the country?
Well, it depends on, I guess, the direction in which the protests continue to go. I think what we saw this weekend was more of an organized effort compared to the earlier
So you're talking
protests.
about the march in Washington?
Yes.
Okay.
Throughout the country.
Yeah.
In New York as well.
Sure, exactly.
Huge following. And I think that one was more of an organized effort in which, the city and the police were actually involved in some type of organization on some level, whereas previous disruption on the West Side Highway and DC on the Beltway and things like that actually led to more disruption and more unpredictability, which probably set uneasy with many authorities. So I guess it depends on the direction in which the protests continue to take.
Dr. Vitale?
Well, I think what's sort of been remarkable about this whole thing has been the intensity of the protests, of the sort of fighting back. No one would be talking about Ferguson if people in Ferguson hadn't made such noise after it happened. And the fact that the protests here have been disruptive, mostly nonviolent, one or two isolated incidents, but very disruptive, I think has created a sense of crisis. Will that lead to institutional change? I mean, I think some things are in the works now, but whether or not they'll be significant enough to really, reduce the burden of the criminal justice system on communities of color, we have to see.
What are in the works?
Well, the mayor already, has announced a few things, dialing back the marijuana arrests. Of course, we've already seen the dial back and stop and frisk. The governor has announced he's going to bring forward a whole raft of measures in the new year after the special session ends. I think one of the things that's on the agenda is an independent police prosecutor. So some tightening up of the accountability mechanisms. But I think we've got a long way to go to address some of the more serious, systematic police practices like broken windows policing and the way the war on drugs is carried out.
Okay. Now, Dr. Johnson, a lot of the narrative about Ferguson and here the Eric Garner case is that this is not about race. It's bigger than just race. Do you agree with that narrative?
Well, it's directly about race, but it's also bigger than race. It's about, our country's history, which is very much tied to race, tied to class. And we're talking about the legitimacy of, our most basic ideals and values of justice and liberty and all these different things. So it's bigger than race, but it's inseparable from race.
Okay, Dr. Vitale, is that because it seems that that narrative has been able to draw in large number of young and the white people in general to come to the cause. Was that a tactical thing? Although you said in the beginning, this was not really organized in a way where you had the traditional leaders taking at the helm. It was basically young people, millennials, through social media, just, hey, let's meet at Union Square, and then we decide what to do next. So is that a tactic to sort of like downplay the racial element to bring a larger audience into the mix?
No, I think actually what's happening is that people are kind of calling a lie on this discourse about being a post-racial society. And I think there are a lot of whites in our society who realize that that's not true as well. That the whites who are joining these protests are doing so, I think, quite explicitly out of a kind of racial solidarity, if you will. Mm-hmm. They are tired of living in a society that practices these kinds of racialized forms of policing. And while they may not be directly affected often by these intensive forms of policing, they see it as a fundamental injustice.
And so how do they address it? I mean, we hear the term white privilege is one that's been battered around. So beyond just like, if you're a white person, beyond just protesting, what else can a white person do to really make the case like, okay, I know you're not targeting me, but I'm offended by this?
Well, to some degree, what they've been doing in terms of being involved in protests, but also allowing for a certain level of discourse to come about from the protests. One of the things that we've been seeing, especially on Twitter, is the tagline "Black Lives Matter," and then the other tagline "All Lives Matter." So that shows some level of schism in the pronouncements about the protests. But I think it's one that's healthy because one understands that we do know that some lives are treated as less valuable by the police, and for them to understand that and to actually have a discourse about that actually makes one aware of their privilege more. It also inspire others to be more involved in protests.
Mm-hmm. Now, earlier, Dr. Vitale, you mentioned broken windows theory. Let's talk about that because it's what Commissioner Bill Bratton believes in. That's his philosophy in fighting crime. So can you explain to our audience what is that? And
yeah, the broken windows theory is really a starkly conservative hypothesis about human behavior with almost no evidence to back it up. It was a kind of analogy that was written about in a magazine, not in an academic journal. And basically what it said is that, you know, poor urban residents left to their own devices will produce chaos and crime. And the only way to effectively address that is to bring the police in as a kind of civilizing force. It's a very moralizing theory. And what it doesn't allow for is the idea that maybe the solution to some of our urban problems is investing in infrastructure, bringing back the jobs that left with deindustrialization, investing in young people. Those are seen as secondary considerations. What's really needed is just this crackdown on public behavior by the police.
But I thought, and tell me if I'm wrong, that part of that was you start with the low-level crimes, because those are the ones that escalate. I remember when Bratton was commissioner under Giuliani, they were just arresting turnstile jumpers at the subway station because they said this is sort of like, if you don't deal with this low-level crime, that person will become a bigger criminal, a more dangerous to society.
Yeah, that's been the argument, but there's no evidence to support that. That disorder and crime, it turns out, are not particularly well linked. And what the police can do using this theory is they can stamp out certain disorder problems. They can get homeless people out of a park. They can get squeegee men off a particular street corner through intensive criminalization and basically driving them into Rikers Island and other places. But there's no evidence that that process then translates into a reduction in homicides or a reduction in armed robberies. That's where the theory breaks down.
Well, I mean, it sounds like police, just regular police work, listening to Dr. Vitale describe broken windows theory. So why is that controversial? And in that case, then, is policing by its nature, controversial.
Oh, absolutely. Just police policy and where do you choose to target crime is controversial. The whole idea of targeting these small crimes and reducing the crime rate, it's curious that the discourse even takes this on as serious. Even when my most basic students who have a limited understanding of sociology, they often say, but what about the conditions in which these people find themselves having to commit crime? Someone without money having to get to work or get to class or school is going to jump the turnstile. The issue is bigger than the individual actors, but the actual conditions which broken windows theory largely ignores the structure. And the most basic sociology student gets that. But it becomes part of the rhetoric in terms of policing that the structure disappears from the conversation.
So what is a brother to do? I mean, Dr. Johnson?
Well, it depends on the situation. Sometimes it's merely survival, and other times it's how do you organize? How do you get people invested in the community? How do you get people to feel like they have ownership in the community, especially when you feel like you're constantly being surveilled? So I think these type of situations are those opportunities, they are those moments where you can actually get meaningful mobilization that actually lasts longer than a moment.
The cynic would say, this is part of course of doing business. Your police, there are going to be incidents like these, and we just have to do a better public relations job. But, we believe that we are the vanguard of society, protect society from chaos. How do you respond to that?
Well, this is like the fallacy of the training suggestion that what's needed here is, teach the police not to use chokeholds, and that'll solve the problem. But the problem is not just occasional acts of excessive use of force, unwarranted shootings, whatever. That doesn't explain the fact that there are now 2.2 million people in prison in the United States, mostly arrested following proper procedures, obeying the law, etc. So it's not just about police brutality, it's also about mass criminalization. And that is where the starkest impact on these poor communities of color is the churning of these young men through the criminal justice system, cutting off their life opportunities, pushing them into career criminality, etc.
Dr. Johnson?
I mean, and it's also a lack of honest conversation from politicians about what the real issues are. Even the discourse early on about police should wear cameras, and that would lead to some level of progress. It maybe will help in some individual cases, but what we're talking about is the actual surveillance of entire communities that would lead to mass incarceration. So once we have actual honest conversations in which politicians can actually confront race, because I think the conversation occurs at other places but not in the political arena, and actually the intersection between politics and economics and race. And those are conversations that are not being had.
One of the conversations that's being had is the whole idea that providing officers with body camera would solve a lot of these problems and will exonerate and sometimes criminalize the behavior of the cops. So what do you guys think about this whole issue? Is it going to make a difference, or is this yet another overzealous solution?
Well, I think, body cameras are only as good as the accountability mechanisms are that are in place. So we've seen that, relying on criminal prosecutions is not really going to be a strategy for creating real accountability, whether we have videotape or not. It never has been, and I don't think it ever will be. There are too many structural deficiencies in that. But the cameras may end up playing an important role in civil litigation, which sometimes results in consent decrees and federal intervention, the courts getting involved, creating special monitors. So that is an area where it could help. It can also help in, exonerating some people.
Dr. Johnson?
And maybe I'm being tongue-in-cheek in saying this, but how long has cops been on the air, right? So we've had cameras, right? I think.
Well, I don't think it's on the air anymore.
But I think that right now the cameras that are most beneficial are the actual civilians who are recording police officers, and we see what type of aggression even people who are recording are met with. So they definitely will have some effect, and I think the actual visual aspect of these brutality and violence being occurring can stimulate protests in ways that probably have been absent. So we actually need to see things sometimes.
Well, we saw things during the Eric Garner incident, and we were told what we were seeing was not right.
Right. And that's what leads to the protests, I think. If there's no camera and they just tell you that we can sweep it away and we can actually see the visual evidence, then that's where you get people say enough is enough.
Stay tuned for more of my discussion with Drs. Lawrence Johnson and Alex Vitale of Brooklyn College on the issue of community policing. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. The Gotham Gazette reports on the call for Governor Cuomo to veto a bill passed in the Assembly and the Senate that will allow the rules for police disciplinary action to be decided in collective bargaining with unions rather than by elected officials. Bill A9853 is an act to amend the civil service law. New York City Council members, including Brad Lander and Jermaine Williams, say that if this bill is signed into law, it will severely undermine the city's ability to hold officers accountable for their actions. The legislation has already been vetoed 4 times by former governors David Paterson, Eliot Spitzer, George Pataki, and Mario Cuomo. The state's Court of Appeals ruled once in 2006 and again in 2012 that police discipline should be left in the hands of public officials and not determined during collective bargaining. Former New York State Governor David Paterson is working with Chinese investors to raise up to $40 million for the first phase of a green taxi project in the city. The money will be invested into the Long Island City-based company New Ride Transportation Group and will be used to help them make their fleet of green cabs more accessible to the elderly and handicapped. Sing Tao Daily reports that Patterson is using the EB-5 investment immigrant program as an incentive while he promotes the project in Shanghai and Nanjing. The EB-5 program allows foreign nationals who invest more than $1 million in the country the opportunity to obtain green cards. Voices of New York reports on India Home, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing the needs of South Asian senior citizens here in America. The organization recently opened its 4th center in Queens. The Desi Senior Center will provide aging South Asian immigrants with social, psychological, recreational, and spiritual services in a culturally sensitive environment. India Home was founded in 2007 by a group of health professionals who grew tired of seeing the lack of viable resources for their aging South Asian immigrant parents. And finally, Harlem is Theater, a new exhibition exploring the rich history of Black theater in Harlem and beyond. The main focus of the exhibition is on Black theater activities within Harlem's boundaries from the 1960s to the present. The president and founder of Community Works NYC, Barbara Horowitz, tells the Amsterdam News that she hopes the exhibit will be a catalyst for a deeper exploration of sometimes forgotten history. It includes displays, historical archives, film, original artwork, and also features a timeline of 50 years of performances produced by New Heritage Theater, the oldest nonprofit Black theater in the city. The exhibit is available Monday through Friday at the Interchurch Center in Harlem from now until January 6, 2015. Those are just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent Sources will be right back.
Welcome back. In studio with me today are Drs. Lawrence Johnson and Alex Vitale. I want to read you a quote from The Economist. It's really chilling. It's from a retired NYPD officer, and he went on to say, there is at least one crazy cop in every precinct. Everyone else knows who they are, but they are impossible to sack until they do something really stupid. Will something really stupid happen here in the Eric Garner case?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure really that Pantaleo is exactly an example of that. He had some previous use of force complaints against him, but that can just be a sign of an officer who's in one of these special units that has a lot of interactions, makes a lot of arrests. But it's certainly been the case that there have been officers that everyone knew was a problem and nothing was done about them. And I think the most dramatic example was the Justin Volpe case, where he tortured Abner Louima in a bathroom in the 7-0 precinct in Brooklyn. Everyone knew this guy was a problem, but no one would stand up to him. No one would take any disciplinary action against him until he did something, totally outrageous.
Is this something that NYPD should be concerned about, dealing with these officers who are really trouble cases?
It sounds like the one bad apples idea, that it's one crazy cop, who's making it bad for everyone. And I think when we look at mass incarceration and stop and frisk, it goes well beyond the crazy officer, but the actual rational practices or the justifications for stop and frisk. So it's the police officer that might be doing his job on a regular day who might not be a bad person, but the act of policing itself becomes the issue, especially when you target certain communities and profile certain groups.
I used to cover crime, and police officers never come to a scene when things are doing well. Things are going well, there's a nice black party, everything is fine. Whenever a cop is called to a scene, something bad is happening. And so with that kind of mindset, how do you train an officer to understand people beyond sort of like criminality?
Well, my feeling has been that rather than focusing so much on training and trying to turn police into officer friendly, what we need to do is to find real alternatives to relying on the police in dealing with a lot of very real community concerns. Why do we need police to show up at a noisy block party? Can't we find ways to empower communities to try to manage these problems themselves? Why were those officers patrolling the pink houses with their guns out on a vertical patrol and then ended up shooting a young man to death who'd done absolutely nothing wrong?
And that's the case of
Kai Gurley.
Okay.
The lights weren't working, the elevators weren't working. Why didn't the residents of that housing project have the power and resources to keep the building in good repair? Why aren't there doormen on those buildings like so many people in Manhattan, enjoy? Those might be more effective and less dangerous ways of managing these problems. Why is it that when someone's son is having a mental health crisis and calls 911, it's the police who show up? We saw this man killed in the yeshiva in Brooklyn about a week ago. There's a videotape on the New York Times website. The officer comes in, and the only tool he has to deal with that situation is to point a gun at the person and yell expletives at him. Get down, escalating the confrontation, and then leads to a situation where they shoot the man to death. While the people in the yeshiva are like, don't shoot, calm down, let's try to deal with this some other way. And the cop does not have the tools to do that. So we need to look at real alternatives so that the police aren't that only force from the city government that people see there to solve their problems.
So Dr. Johnson, are we likely to see doormen at the pink houses anytime soon?
if the residents change, right? But I do think they don't have to become officer friendly, but they do need to get out of police cars and actually know who the residents are. And I think that's a huge thing, to actually not jump out of a police car and make someone assume the position, but to actually interact with people on a regular basis where you come to realize their lives do have meaning, because I think oftentimes they look at potential criminals. And if you automatically reduce someone to a criminal, you get someone who is sworn to serve and protect, who fears for himself and shoots someone in a dark hallway.
Mm-hmm. My concern about that, if I could, is that when we're asking those officers to wage a war on drugs across the board in these communities, when we're asking these officers to engage in this widespread broken windows, low-level policing and harassment, it's just not possible for them to do that in a respectful way that's acknowledging who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, because what they believe is that everyone is a bad guy. And the reality is, who has not broken the law? Who's not jaywalked? I always ask my students, who has never jaywalked across from one side of campus to another? Who's not driving,
You mean that's
on
a crime? I mean, in New
Well,
York?
you can get a ticket for it. It's a violation, right? But so my point is that when the mindset is, especially when it's driven by quotas, when the mindset is everything's a potential violation, everyone's a potential criminal, they really aren't interested in trying to figure out who the good people are and the bad people are.
Now, Are there any departments across the country who are doing things right and are handling situation on a regular basis, de-escalating conflicts and really applying good police practices?
No one is doing a good job across the board, in my opinion. But there are pieces in place in different areas. Excuse me. So, for instance, we have a model for mental health policing in a lot of places that involve crisis intervention teams, so that it's not just the police who show up, it's also a trained mental health worker who's experienced in de-escalating these situations. There are places where we're trying to dial back aspects of the war on drugs, where people are, saying maybe it doesn't make sense to criminalize everyone over this stuff. There are places that have tried to build relationships with communities to engage in real problem solving. But in all the places doing those things, there are still major problems with over-policing.
The war on drug, is that what we're dealing with here? Many of the problems that police departments across the country are facing because there is such a strong emphasis from the federal government on this war on drugs?
It's a huge problem. It is responsible for the increased militarization of policing. It's responsible for the erosion of the Fourth Amendment broadly. It's responsible for the kind of police invasiveness in people's lives. And it has turned whole communities in the eyes of the police into a criminal class. Because for so many young people, access to the black market is their only avenue for economic activity, because they've been systematically excluded from formal labor markets, especially young men of color without a high school degree. And so rather than criminalizing those black markets, we need to find ways to legalize them, to bring them into the formal economy. Now, that's not going to solve all the problems for these communities, but it will stop the collateral consequences of the felony arrests, the denial of licenses, the inability to get financial aid, this whole punitive mindset that has played out in a profoundly racialized way.
Dr. Johnson, your thought on this issue?
Well, I wanted to go back to the earlier question. I think it's definitely related. I think the response to people all over the country has been a recognition that what's happening in Ferguson and Staten Island happens in so many different places. And it is the effect of the war on drugs, which escalated the amount of surveillance of Black and Latino communities. And Chicago has probably had a very strong reaction because of decades of dealing with Officer Burge. It's an officer who was actually accused of torturing over 100 Black men throughout the 80s and 90s. And when you think about Eric Garner or Michael Brown, you think about what officers like John Burge was able to do in Chicago for so long. And I think the war on drugs actually does criminalize a whole community, and there's less sympathy when you associate someone with a potential drug dealer and this person is also the victim of state violence.
There's the real challenge here is that, these communities of color, they experience the negative effects of drugs profoundly. Mm-hmm. But we've had a war on drugs for 30, 40 years. Drugs are cheaper, of better quality, and easier to get. And it's not like the police can point to some big victory about how, oh, no high school student in the country can get drugs now, when in fact exactly the opposite is true. So yes, drugs can be a big problem, but policing has never been an effective solution.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Dr. Vitale, Dr. Johnson, thanks for joining us.
You're most welcome.
We'll be right back. That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.